Hello, bonjour. Mon nom est Michael Orsini. Je suis le directeur de l'Institut d'études féministes et de genre. I'm the chair institute of the Institute for Feminist and Gender Studies. Very happy to have to be part of this event with CRIAW on obviously I think a topic that has been getting much more attention within universities, and some of that attention I think is good, and some of that has been challenging, I think, for how we think about the connections between communities and researchers. I am just going to introduce the distinguished panel, some of whom are physically here and some of whom are not. We have Jane Stinson, who's here, who's the principal investigator and director of CRIAW's FemNorthNet project. She's been part of CRIAW for a fairly long time, 6 years, including a year as president, and she's been very active at CUPE for more than 3 decades, I think. Our second speaker is in Halifax, Deborah Stienstra. Hello, Deborah.
Hi, Michael. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you. Who's a professor in disability studies at the University of Manitoba, and she's published extensively in the field of disability. She's currently on leave from the University of Manitoba, and she holds the Nancy Chair in Women's Studies at Mount St. Vincent University in Halifax, where she joins us. She's been an important leader in the field with FemNorthNet as academic co-director of the project with Jane. So thank you, Deborah. And finally, we have Leah Levac, who is a professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Guelph. Leah works on community-engaged policy development, feminist intersectional analysis and policy development, with a particular interest in marginalized publics such as youth. So I welcome all 3 speakers and look forward to an engaging conversation. Thanks.
So I'll start first. Thank you very much, Michael, for sponsoring this event, for lunch, and for this introduction. And as actually, it's a CRIAW practice that we should be also thanking the Algonquin people upon whose land we're visiting, and has never been, it's unceded land. So I'm going to start provide a bit of an overview of a little bit about CRIAW and some of the challenges over the past decade, and certainly what we've been learning through our research project called FemNorthNet. So I wanted to start really with a very deep thanks to Michael, to the Institute of Gender and Women's Studies, and to the preceding director, Claire Turen-Solander, for providing CRIAW with a home when we really needed it. Because you can imagine how not being homeless actually helps a lot in managing a very precarious environment as a community-based research institute. And it was actually about 10 years ago I started on the board of CRIAW, and sort of shortly after that, things became very, very difficult, particularly in 2006, when the Harper government decided to shut down the Status Women Canada offices, stop funding research and advocacy through the Status Women Canada, which had been such an important source of actually getting CRIAW established and ongoing funding over the years. Despite efforts to diversify, that was still sort of a pretty consistent and important source of funding. So I want to draw on a bit about CRIAW, FemNorthNet, and then Deborah and Leah are going to further demonstrate the relevance of community-based research through their presentations. And we've just been joined by Lise Martin, the former executive director of CRIAW. So welcome, thank you. All right, so the next slide, CRIAW in the age of austerity, 39 with an uncertain future. I think it just sort of felt like what's happening to the organization sort of parallels what's happening to some of our lives as well, right? That these days it can be very, very difficult, and our futures can be very uncertain and precarious. But CRIAW has an amazing history, a rich history, and I think that helps it survive. It's done tremendous work to build bridges over many years between the academy and community around research that's focused on women. It's provided different ways to amplify the voices of feminist researchers, used to sponsor conferences, has had a number of publications, has just launched a new one called the Feminist Voice and is using his website and sort of modern tools, I think, really effectively to reach out, make people aware of what we're doing, and try to stay really relevant to both our older members and young women. So it was in 2010 that after the changes by the Harper government, that CRIAW was forced to sort of really downsize, to eliminate most of its staff, down to like a part-time administrator. We closed the office, sold everything, and moved to University of Ottawa, thanks to our friends here. But shortly after that, in 2010, we were awarded a rare honor, actually. CRIAW got $1 million SSHRC Cura grant. And it is very uncommon that community-based organizations would get funding, especially at that level, from SSHRC. It was interesting, though, because of our precarious financial situation, SSHRC did not want to transfer the money to us, and instead required that we find a university to administer those funds. So again, we're very thankful to the University of Ottawa for agreeing to do that and for negotiating an arrangement which gives us full control over the project, but acts as our sort of liaison with SSHRC around financial reports and things like that. So that's a bit of a background, and I think sort of starts to sort of sketch a picture of the challenges of community-based research in a precarious environment, of today. But I just want to talk a bit about FemNorthNet and the work that we've been doing over the past 5 years through that research project. We chose to focus on women and economic restructuring in Northern Canada for a number of reasons. One, it was becoming clearer, decline in manufacturing in the south and the rise of resource-based industries in the north, and that's only become sort of clearer and clearer, more attention focused on it since we began in 2010. It was clear that some communities were booming, but not everybody within them was doing well. And that it's also it's the boom and bust cycle, right? So we've seen since we began a booming economy. For example, in Labrador West is now starting to tank as one of the mines is closed. The other major mine has announced its layoffs as demand has started to decline in China, right? For those global ore market. And it's clear as well that the industry in the north was really sort of changing those communities, and that women are really left out of the discussions, both about sort of development of northern communities, about resource extraction, about what it means for them and communities, other than maybe the extent to which they might find work, and there it tends to be as housekeepers and cooks still. So in the Feminist Northern Network, we have the next slide, 3 northern communities we've been focusing on: Thompson, Manitoba, Labrador West, and Happy Valley, Goose Bay. And we've been exploring sort of 4 themes that run through these communities and the issues involved. In CRIAW's tradition, we're a network that brings together university and community-based people. It's a participatory action research project, right, where we're really seeking to work with community partners and engage women in the community in making change, as well as sort of understanding what's going on and writing about it. And you're going to hear more from Deborah and Leah about some of those specifics. Maybe just briefly, some of the things we've done or have been doing, like in the infrastructure and economic development theme, the focus is really on social infrastructure. Because again, tend to focus on the roads or, the hard physical infrastructure, but not the childcare, not the social services, not all of the things that really support women and communities and have a good quality of life. And in northern communities, there's a bigger deficit. I mean, there's bigger needs and fewer services. So that was important to talk about and get people thinking and familiar with the notion of social infrastructure. Governance and engagement theme. One of the things that they found is, well, you can't really expect local people to be engaged if they never see themselves in this community. And that was particularly referred to the Indigenous people around Thompson. So our project, Carolyn Andrews, the academic co-lead, and Charlene Lafreniere from Thompson are actually documenting the history, particularly the Indigenous and women's history in Thompson for the first time. It's never been written. So you know, it's sort of, that was the first step. If we really want people to be engaged, they need to feel part of this community first. And as well, that theme has been doing some really interesting work overseeing the Thompson Economic Diversification Working Group. So they've been sort of providing a gender lens to that work, which has not always been that well accepted. And the community inclusion and exclusion theme, both Deborah and Leah have been active in, so you're going to hear more about that. The next slide is just sort of to say that we were able as well to, from that base of the CRIAW grant, to really expand our horizons. Right, we were able to get an additional grant from Status 1 Canada to do work particularly on developing community leaders. And part of the reason we sought that money out was because our community partners were saying, we're stretched so thin on the ground, we can't do this work. You know, we built into our budgets some community support, but it was insufficient. Because again, the needs are just sort of going through the roof, right? As social services get cut, as industry creates new problems. So we partly sought additional funding from Status 1 Canada to provide more support to our community partners so that they could be engaging women in the community in this active research. Community Vitality Index is another important initiative that Deborah and Leah got additional money for, and Leah will be speaking about. Deborah also got additional funds for an initiative called Building Links Among Women, which perhaps she'll be able to talk to us a bit about, but it's building this connection between women in Nova Scotia who are going to benefit from a new hydro source at Muskrat Falls in Labrador, so that they understand what are the consequences on the local community, what are the consequences on the local women, and local women getting a better understanding of sort of some of the need for that energy as well, to replace coal-fired sources. I just wanted to, I guess, close by focusing on a few community research challenges. One is, I guess, through FemNorthNet, it is really hard to be a community activist right now in northern communities. I'd argue in Ottawa too, but it certainly came through in our research there. It's even harder to be an outspoken feminist community activist, and even harder to be an outspoken post-colonial feminist activist, right? I mean, if you want to really challenge those power relations, you're taking a lot on, particularly in smaller communities where there's a lot of emphasis put on the jobs that are being created through resource extraction. I guess another point that's extremely important is that there's a weak organizational base, right, for feminist organizing. You know, nationally, we started by talking about changes of Status Women Canada there, but we sort of see it in all sorts of ways, whether it's the cuts to social infrastructure, to social programs, to women's programs specifically, all sorts of community things, so that there's sort of less institutional support and a lot more to do on a voluntary basis. So women are stretched incredibly thin, and self-care became a major theme that came out of our research, right, to prevent burnout or to deal with burnout. That because there's, in smaller northern communities especially, a couple women, really a handful, that sort of hold things together, and it has a huge impact on them physically and emotionally. The funding for women's centers being cut is important. Keep your eye on the Newfoundland Labrador budget coming out soon and see whether or not the network of status women's centers that still exists in that province will survive this budget, right? New Brunswick cut them a couple years ago. And I think Newfoundland Labrador may be one of the few remaining provinces that still has a network of these community-based status women's centers that do a lot of work in each community. So it'll be interesting to see whether they survive or whether their budgets are cut back. And maybe advocacy, threatening funding, right? Like this is another sort of theme that came out from our research. And from our own experience, right? Anyone who's followed Bill C-51, right? We sort of see the threats now of being advocates, that you risk losing government funding, federal government funding in particular, especially if you have a charitable status. So this has huge implications. So the final, another slide on challenges of precarity, it increases the burnout and the instability, right? Stability is so important. Otherwise, it's constant turnover and it's incredibly inefficient, right? And you can imagine trying to sort of move forward in that context when you're always having to be replacing people, right? Precarity undermines human rights. Like, we have human rights formally, but lots of us don't feel we can actually apply them because we're too vulnerable. We're vulnerable to losing our jobs, we're vulnerable to losing our housing, whatever, right? We're vulnerable to being excluded within our communities. So again, the more precarious one is, I think the harder it is to actually exercise human rights like free speech or standing up against discrimination. Precarity for community-based researchers means there's just fewer studies, right? There's less action research, and there's probably a very different focus of the research that's coming out and less community voice that's coming out. But anyway, I don't want to end on a gloomy note. I think that it isn't all gloomy, that CRIAW does do amazing things, and other organizations and activists show tremendous resilience, creativity, continue to take incredible initiatives. And I'm really encouraged by continuing to sort of attract younger women. I mean, we're seeing that in CRIAW, and I think it's so important to the future. Again, I think it's helpful, it's incredibly helpful to be at the university to sort of help where there are a lot of younger women, and sort of easier to connect. So those were the things I just wanted to emphasize, and I guess before closing, to encourage you, if you haven't gone to the CRIAW website, please do so. There's a lot of resources there that are free. If you're a teacher, professor, you want to include things in your materials, we're happy to do so and can negotiate special prices if there's a charge. For students, I think they find it helpful. And again, really encourage you to become a member. If you're not yet a member, there's different fees, right? If you're a student, a lower fee. It is just really important that we continue to grow our membership base to survive this age of austerity. Thanks. So if people don't mind, because it's being recorded, we thought we'd just carry on with the other presentations and then open it up to discussion about anything, okay?
The part of thinking that I wanted to share with you today was the place I find myself currently. I find myself located in women's studies and a scholar in disability studies, and asking what those two have to do with each other. And so I've begun to talk about my thinking as implicating inclusion, and particularly talking about the relationships between feminism, disability, and communities. So could you change the slide? Next slide. Thanks. And I too want to acknowledge that I'm standing on Mi'kmaq lands, unceded lands, Mi'kmaq lands that where the Mi'kmaq entered generously into peace and friendship treaties that we haven't done such a good job on maintaining in terms of peace and friendship. And despite the legacy and the ongoing legacy of colonization and practices, I find there's still so much generosity and willingness to engage with those of us who are settlers. And I'm really happy to be here, so thanks for inviting me. Next slide. So I'd like to frame my understanding of inclusion, which really comes from my world of disability studies, where inclusion is a goal, and so much of our research is about how to prevent exclusion from happening, the exclusion in particular of women, men, boys, and girls with disabilities, and convincing policymakers that it's important to build inclusive communities, and there are costs associated with excluding specific members. So for me, inclusion can't happen unless it's transformative, unless it involves a notion of change. And so in this particular conversation, I think CRIAW and FemNorthNet have a history of trying to create space for a variety and a diversity of voices. And I know the organizations of women with disabilities in Canada name CRIAW as one of their strongest and longest serving allies. And I'm glad to hear that Lise Martin is in the audience. Hi, Lise. Really a sense that women with disabilities have been well included in the work of CRIAW for a very long time. So in part, it's thinking through how do we sustain those relationships in the context of trying to promote transformative inclusion, as well as a rich and deep intersectional practice and theory. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about what that means. When I've talked about this in the past, I've used stories of particular women that I know. I can't do that today because I don't have enough time. But I wanted to share with you some of the definitions of inclusion that I use. One from the Canadian Association for Community Living, which is the conviction by yourself and by others that you belong, and the demonstration that it's true. One of the indicators for me that we belong is when we have the resources that we need and the supports that we need without even having to ask. So if you're in that room right now, you must have the lights turned on. Am I correct? Are the lights turned on? Yes. For those of you who are sighted, that's a support that you need. They're not really turned on. I have a light turned on. It's a support that we as sighted people need in order to see in rooms that are built without a lot of natural light or whatever. We don't even have to ask for that support to be there. All we have to do is flip the switch. So if I were to give you a task and turn off the lights, you might not be able to do that. But my blind friends would have no troubles doing that because they don't need that support. So for me, the infrastructure of hydroelectricity, lighting, all of those sorts of things are a disability related support for sighted people, right? It's something we need in order to be accommodated in a world that requires lights. For me, transformative inclusion, I was recently asked by a scholar why I used a feminist disability studies framework rather than just feminism. And I've thought about that question for quite a while. What difference does it make to include women with disabilities and girls with disabilities to feminist theory and practice? And so for me, I've come to understand that including women and girls with disabilities is transformative to feminist theory. And that's most of what I want to talk about today. So it's transformative in how we live, how we love, how we understand, how we think, how we write, how we research, and how we take action to reflect human diversity. And so I titled this talk, Implicating Inclusion, and the verb to implicate means to involve as a consequence, to be an intimate relationship or incriminating connection. Well, I really like the notion of being in an intimate relationship. And I believe that feminism and disability are in intimate relationships in the context of transformative inclusion. And in FemNorthNet, I think we're trying to make some of that happen, some of that transformative inclusion, with the good, the bad, and the difficult. So could we change the slide? There are 4 lessons that I think this relationship of intimate connection or implicating inclusion requires us to think about. Just as a summary, recognize and practice deep and rich intersectionality, sustain the community roots of feminism, make, sustain, and implement a commitment to inclusive practices and inclusive design, and value and support diverse embodiments, including living with disabilities. The first one should be pretty familiar to those of you in the academy. Intersectionality is a theory, but I think that often we get stuck practicing shallow and what I call shallow or thin intersectionality. where we do quickly the trilogy gender, race, class, or we do the extended list of gender, race, class, age, ability as our illustration of women's diversities. And I think that we often have an orthodoxy in feminist theory that puts gender first and foremost in our analysis and says that that has to be our first way in to an analysis. And that leads us to what I think is a thin or shallow intersectionality. When I work with Indigenous women with disabilities, like the woman I would have talked about, Diane Scribe-Nigany, I begin to understand how complex those relationships are. And I think in FemNorthNet, we've really experienced how difficult it is to hold intersectionality in its complexity and to really work on that together. Because sometimes our different identities come into conflict with each other. So in FemNorthNet, we've had to face the reality that Indigenous and disability aren't always comfortably seated together in Northern communities. And we've had to figure out why that happens, and I'm happy to talk more about that in the future. So for me to implicate or have intimate relationships between feminism and disabilities takes, I think, both a skillful and a rich approach to intersectionality. A second lesson that I learned from this, and in part it's from the leadership of women with intellectual disabilities, those that I've come to know over a long period of time, who have no place in the academy and who are structured out of the academy. So women's and gender studies, feminist studies like the Institute are important parts of the academy. And we fought long and hard to have our voices as women's studies scholars and feminist scholars be part of the academy. We remain under attack and our resources are often constrained and minimalized. But I think we've claimed a place in knowledge creation that's changing and has changed the academy. Unfortunately, for me, it's come at the cost of our community-based roots. Our knowledge is increasingly technical and jargon-filled. We speak to each other as academics and engage in debates that I think are not entirely clearly important to many of the women in the community centers that we work with. And we leave little room for the expertise of those women to come into our classroom, our intellectual gatherings, or our academic publications. So we have little hope, I think, of engaging women with disabilities, and especially women with intellectual disabilities, in our practice as academic feminists. At the most obvious level, my colleague Valerie Wolbert, who's a woman leader with intellectual disabilities, isn't eligible to enter university as a student. She doesn't meet the admission criteria, so she will continually be structured out of any women's studies discussions. And I think we have to really reflect as women's studies scholars, how do we address some of those gaps? Valerie's expertise as a feminist leader isn't widely recognized or accepted within feminism. She's not quick thinking, she's not quick speaking, and we as intellectuals prize those characteristics. She often needs support to help her understand what's being discussed and what's important. Having her in the room can slow things down, but having her in the room is critical, I think, to feminist theorizing, because she reminds us not just of the importance of wit, logic, and intellectual rigor, but of the importance of passion, relationships, and heart as part of what feminist theory is about. We also, I think, need to make, sustain, and implement a commitment to inclusive practices and think about what it takes in our teaching and our research to have inclusive practices and inclusive spaces. And in FemNorthNet, in our community inclusions and exclusions theme, together with Dawn Canada, we've created a toolkit called Diversity Through Inclusive Practices, which helps people to understand what it takes to have inclusion in our events and processes on a variety of grants, not simply on disability grants, but some rich information on that as well. And I think when I raise this point about inclusion, and that inclusion doesn't usually happen unless we are attentive to it and really take conscious effort and skill, often meet awkward silences. I'll have folks say to me, it costs too much to provide sign language interpretation. We don't know how to engage women with intellectual disabilities. We don't know where to go for attendant care. And in the end, there's a grudging admission that we can't include everyone, and we'll just have to go with that and live with it. But what ends up happening is that systematically excludes women with disabilities because we're just too difficult to include. My answer is pretty simple to this. We'll never include women with disabilities in our discussions unless we budget for and use the funds to support a presence. And I think that's what FemNorthNet has been trying to do. And our colleague Carmela Hutchison has been one of the leaders around that. A fourth and final thing that I think implicating inclusion, that intimate relationship reminds us, is that we all come with diverse embodiments and that it's important to value living with disabilities. I think the recent court, and I don't want to detract us, but I think the recent Supreme Court decision on assisted death is one of those ways that is, I think, particularly difficult for people with disabilities to feel included in society, because the highest court of the land is saying that if it gets to be too much to be a person with disabilities, we'll help you end your life. If the court said that to us as women or to Indigenous people, that it's too much, if your oppression gets too much, we'll help you commit suicide, I think we'd be up in arms. At this point, however, we need to say that we cannot be human unless all of us are human, and until all of our humanity is recognized, valued, and included in our society. So for me, transformative inclusion changes us through experiences that unsettle us, that create discomfort. We may want to push away those experiences, but they're important teachers for us. And so I think those unsettling experiences implicate us to explore those intimate connections between feminism, disabilities, and communities. Thank you.
Thanks, Deborah. So perhaps we can just carry on with Leah. And Leah's going to tell us about her work in the community, developing the Community Vitality Index.
Great. Thanks, Jane. I'm just going to start my clock here. All right, well, I also would like to thank you all for being here today and acknowledge that here in Guelph, I am on Attawandaron territory whose ancestors are connected to the Seneca people of the Iroquois Confederacy. It's a real pleasure to be speaking about our work in Labrador. I'm a community engaged scholar based here at the University of Guelph, but was connected to the University of Manitoba during my postdoctoral research, and it's within the context that Jane and Deborah have described of FemNorthNet based at CRIAW that I'm going to take the next 15 minutes or so to elaborate on one particular research program that was a part of that larger study. Next slide, please. From 2012 to 2014, I worked with a team of community and academic researchers to develop a community vitality index, which I'll describe in more detail shortly, but which is essentially a framework for trying to understand and track community well-being from the perspective of women in the context of a changing Labrador. I'll focus my comments on the overall goals of that research, our process and methods, and the resulting community vitality index, and we'll then spend my last few minutes offering some thoughts on the overall question of this panel, namely, why is community-based research relevant to feminism? Next slide, please. So let me begin with the overall goals of the research, which I will say were generally threefold. First, we set out to create a space for women's voices, particularly so they could discuss their well-being needs and preferences, and ultimately so that we could understand the definition of well-being for women in the North. This goal was based in part on a limitation of existing well-being indices, Specifically, that none, and we reviewed many, including Newfoundland's Community Accounts, the Canadian Index of Wellbeing, the Inuvialuit Wellbeing Health Indicators, and the First Nations Community Wellbeing Index, were able to provide an intersectional, localized picture of well-being that reflects women's understandings of well-being. The second goal was that we set out to create this community vitality index based on women's definition of well-being as part of a strategy to embed the voices and preferences of diverse women into the decision-making processes that affect their lives. And this is a goal that aligns quite tightly with something that Jane mentioned, which was to better understand and respond not only to women's historical exclusion from the economic agenda setting, but also from local decision-making in the Canadian North. And finally, we wanted to think about the ways that this empirical research, and specifically feminist intersectional participatory research as a version of community-based research, contributes both to our practical and theoretical understanding of a number of academic concepts. And it's from our work related to this last goal that I'll draw some of my closing thoughts about the importance of community-based scholarship to feminism. Next slide, please. So with these goals in mind, let me give you an overview of how we developed the CVI. We created and implemented a staged but iterative research process that included several months of foundational work to establish community relevance and presence. Our overall research process, which included foundational work, community workshops, an external validation component, the development of a revised draft then of the CVI, and then a community training workshop and community piloting process. I'll only talk about the community workshops and community training and piloting in more details, but I'm happy to answer questions about other parts of the process during the discussion. First, though, I want to point out that aligned with the tenets of participatory research, our process was both iterative and flexible to really allow for meaningful attempt to co-produce knowledge with women in the community. I also want to note that we focused on being intersectional and community-based in both the way we thought about the theories guiding our work and the methods orienting our work. And in saying this, I sort of want to highlight 2 points. The first is that the theoretical framework and our methodological approach and our commitments as feminist scholars were inextricably linked. And I think this speaks to the points that Deborah made about implicating inclusion. As Frisbee and McGuire and Reed point out in a great article that's called "The F Word Has Everything to Do with It," feminist goals and participatory research goals are particularly compatible because of their focus on strategies for change. The second thing I want to point out is that this approach really allowed us to undertake what an intersectional scholar, Rita DeMoon, talks about as a critique of the work and effects of power, not only in our own practice, but in the work that we were undertaking to build this community vitality index. So in terms of these community workshops that were really at the heart of our methodological process, during two-day workshops, 26 local women who ranged in age from 18 to 60 came together through a series of discussions and activities and ultimately created a definition of well-being that resonated across a number of differently situated women in the community, gathered stories that highlighted women's well-being experiences, determined categories of well-being that captured women's stories and definitions, and identified individual and contextual factors that affected women's well-being. The workshop participants were involved as research collaborators and were therefore compensated for their involvement. As another example of our commitment to this collaborative approach, we modified the design of these workshops as they were being delivered, a practice that community engaged scholars sometimes refer to as designing a plane while flying it. As a starting point, though, even though we modified constantly over the course of the implementation, The design of the workshops drew from a number of resources, including literature that described practices of engaging with diverse communities in community decisions, and that highlighted the importance of providing people from historically marginalized groups, including women, with particular supports in order to facilitate their inclusion. An example of how we operationalized this was by engaging 2 community social workers as participants and resource people throughout the process so that others involved in the process could receive support as needed during the workshops. Additionally, we drew heavily on a local research assistant's past experiences to inform the logistics of the workshop, for example, of how we shared power in the process. We collected data as audio recordings of group discussions, collaborators' discussion notes, flip charts from large group conversations, murals and visual representations of well-being, again, some of which you can see on the screen, written definitions of well-being, field notes, and evaluation questionnaires. These data were then collected, and along with additional data collected during our external validation process, were used to draft the initial version of the CVI framework and the accompanying survey. The community pilot was a process that took place over several months, and women who were involved in the initial workshop were also involved in reviewing drafts, coming together to participate in training as research collaborators, and ultimately piloting the CVI around with other women in the community. They completed a half-day training session on research ethics, data collection, and the contents of the CVI, and provided feedback both from themselves and based on conversations that they had with other women in the community. This provided the overall research team with the opportunity to validate the survey that accompanies the CVI, adding to its internal strength and its external credibility. Workshop participants also had the opportunity to reassert their collective ownership over the project and to engage in dialogue with other women in the community, sharing and gathering new knowledge relevant to women's well-being. Ultimately, we saw this as a part of a related goal of the work, which was to focus on deliberate leadership practices that engage, that are sort of fundamental to the work of many social change organizations. Next slide, please. So, and actually, I guess I can do this now too. The substantive results of this process then included a conceptual framework, which you can see here on the screen, a community-developed definition of well-being, a survey that includes both identity and social position questions from 5 different categories of well-being, and also exists in both a short form and a long form, which was a decision that the community made to try and both collect an extensive, robust amount of data and encourage survey uptake from people who were less interested in spending too long, and stories about the well-being of women in Happy Valley, Goose Bay. I want to talk for a minute about this conceptual framework, which you can see is based on an Inukshuk and was designed eventually after it was created by women in the community by 2 artists from the Nunatsiavut government who work there as graphic designers and who collaborated in the research to produce this image for us. The community research collaborators described the Inukshuk, an image that they collectively chose, as representing balance, uniqueness, direction, and connection to the earth. Within the stones of the Inukshuk, you can see 5 webs or nets: the fishing net, the spider's web, the womb, the snowshoe, and the dream catcher. These are symbolic for many reasons, which community collaborators, and I want to use a quote here, described as follows. In the development of the CVI, we started our work together by building a web between participants. The connections in our web helped us do our work. Like women's well-being, a net is best when all of its connections are strong. Also, a net doesn't work properly if it has holes in it or if strands of the net are missing. Social support, which comes from connections to others, is essential to well-being. It is also important, however, to recognize that networks full of connections that we feel trapped in can hurt our well-being. Nets are mostly positive, but they can sometimes be negative. Through the data collected throughout the research process, collaborating women also explained that the webs or the nets are components of their collective identity as women, as Indigenous people, as fishers, and as people connected to the land. I won't dwell on the definition of well-being that was developed as part of the project, nor on the details of the resulting well-being survey. However, I've included the next two slides specifically to demonstrate the importance of this knowledge co-production process. For example, women's emphasis on the importance of safe public meeting spaces, on cultural acceptance, and on comfort with expressing personal opinions are not things that we would anticipate in well-being indices, and not things that we would have identified had we simply reviewed literature on women's well-being. Nevertheless, these and many other indicators were seen as essential by community collaborators, highlighting the importance of locally relevant well-being definitions as part of a larger conversation about women's active engagement in decision-making processes. So drawing from this work, let me close by offering what I think are two key reasons that community-based research is important to feminism. The first is that the empirical work of community-based research is necessary for theoretical development in areas that are complementary to feminism. In the case of the CVI, we've done particular work in relational leadership, in intersectionality, in gender equality measurement, and in participatory and deliberative democracy. And all of these areas feed feminist thought. For example, evolving our understanding of what constitutes leadership and how leadership develops and is practiced or informed by the institutional and organizational structures helps us think more carefully about the work of feminist organizations. Given that community-based research is sometimes described as a method that democratizes research, it also makes sense that we can make a contribution to feminism by contributing our empirical findings to testing and refining the theories of participatory and deliberative democracy, including by responding to the feminist critiques offered by people like Iris Marion Young and others who express concern about the real equalizing power of deliberation in the context of unequalizing power, of unequal deliberative capacities. The second point and final point that I want to make is that this work teaches us about solidarity, which for me is a fundamental principle of feminist practice. Who speaks for whom, who gives presentations when and where and how, which or whose goals are foregrounded, how is inclusion maintained, what does agency look like? These and many more questions continue to demand attention, and the answers we come up with will have a profound impact on how the practices of feminism evolve. Thank you.
All right. So thank you, everyone, for sitting through all those three presentations. And maybe we can just open it up to any questions or comments that you have. Michael.
Okay, I'll ask. So let's start with the question. Thanks for the presentations. I guess I just wanted to hear a little bit more about certainly the promise of community-based research I'm sold on, but the pitfalls just concern me more. So I think that a lot of us talk about engaging, and a lot of us want to engage, but we run up against all kinds of things that are the product of the environment in which we do research, that are the product of our limited engagements with communities in the first place, and Indigenous communities become a challenge. I've heard a lot of feminists say very, let's say, disconcerting things about disability. So, and it's great that Deborah sort of addressed some of the links in feminist and disability studies, but we shouldn't. I think there's this kind of concern that well-meaning people can't screw up. And so I guess I understand where community-based research comes from, and I have no difficulty supporting that at an intellectual level, but on the ground level, I think we do ourselves a disservice by not sort of calling out some of the problems that academics commit, but also community people can get it wrong too.
Right.
Sorry, is that a question? I don't know.
I think it's a great comment, if not question, right? And maybe I just invite Deborah or Leah if you wanted to respond at all to what Michael's raising, the challenges, the problems of doing community-based research.
Can I start?
Sure.
Okay. Thanks, Michael. I think it's, I often talk with my students about how to do research with authenticity, reciprocity, and relationships. And it seems to me that when you do community-based research, you can't assume that that it's going to be authentic relationships and reciprocal relationships unless you build that in right at the beginning. So I think thinking through how to do this requires us first to create those relationships, and they have to be meaningful and mutual relationships. The phrase that I always use in FemNorthNet is everybody has to receive something and everybody has to give something to the partnership. I think too often we as academics believe that we can take the knowledge without necessarily recognizing that mutuality relationship. I think one of the, and so I hope Leah will talk a little bit more about some of the research agreements that we've come to in order to reflect the mutual assistance agreements. But I also wanted to say, I think from the community side, some of the things that surprised me, probably the most difficult piece for me of the relationship building piece was the tension around Indigenousness and disability. I think that as a scholar, I can come in, and as a disability activist and somebody who identifies as a person with disabilities can come in and say, this is really important. But to have our community partners say, well, it isn't to us. And to have my feminist colleagues, not necessarily on the team, but in some cases say, okay, you've protected all these resources. Can't we just use them for something else? We're not going to engage women with disabilities. I think it takes a long process of educating people and listening to why they have these differing views on the importance of, for example, disability. And I know Jane and I have had many, many conversations about how to do this in a way that keeps the spirit of what we're trying to do in FemNorthNet alive. And we know that it's a process. It's a process of education and learning on both sides. And so a piece of it is creating the space for that to happen. And that allows mutuality, I think, to happen. But,
thanks, Deborah. Leah, did you want to add anything?
Sure. Well, just quickly to pick up on the point that Deborah mentioned. So one of the very practical ways that we do that is by sort of through a process that we've been working on over the last several years of transforming our consent forms within our research ethics applications into sort of borrowing from Indigenous scholarship and transforming those consent forms into mutual assistance agreements. And we create templates essentially for what all of the partners in the research want to take out of the research, and then we commit to those as a form of consenting to be collaborators throughout the process. We've sort of worked on this in different formats and in different ways with different groups, but as one piece of some of the larger questions. And I guess the other point that I just would make quickly is that one of the points that I heard you mention, Michael, has to do with the institutions. Oh, there goes Deborah.
She'll come back.
One of the points that I heard you make was about sort of some of the institutional constraints within which we work. And not only through my experience CRIAW, but also through the Institute for Community Engaged Scholarship here at Guelph, one of the things that I think has been really instrumental to trying to facilitate this work from the perspective of academic institutions is to be able to have organizations or institutes that have the capacity to deal with some of the different logistics that are required for actual meaningful collaborations that can simply have to do with how quickly you can get refunds and stipends out to people, and then up to more sort of complex questions around sort of navigating space that is inclusive. And so this sort of quasi-autonomous institutional structure that facilitates some of these relationships has been really instrumental in the work that I've been involved with.
Thank you.
Great.
For response.
Yes.
Yes. Thank you very much for all the information and for your presentation. It has been very interesting for me. My name is Joana Martinez Palacios. I come from the University of the Basque Country, and I am here as
Visiting scholar.
Yeah.
Visiting.
My English is not very good. I am sorry for that. I will try to explain in English. I say that it's very interesting for me, your presentation, because I belong to a research group who research with the community-based research also. And it's very significant. Significant that when our research group, whose name is Patriarchus, start in 2006, they start without a feminist approach. And when feminist women has involved in this research group, we have created another research group parallel with the feminist approach, because we have conflict there. So I have been very in touch with all your comments, because I feel very near your work from my work. So I have, about this comment, I have two questions. I want to know more, if it is possible. You have tell us about the challenge that we have to overcome. When we use this approach, and when we are feminist and when we are post-colonial. And one of those is the self-care is crucial against the burnout. I don't know if you have a think about the strategies that we can use as a researcher not to burn off and to maintain the self-care. So that is one question. The second question is about the first national women. I want to learn more about this project. I don't know if you have written specifically to as I can read and learn more. So
About the Canadian Research Institute and the advancement of women specifically.
Yeah.
Okay.
And the first question is the name of the third participant was Leah Levac. Yeah. So it was very interesting, the presentation also, and I have one question about the. Do you know or have you recalled the testimony? Yeah, the testimony of the women who have participated in this program in terms of the benefits that they have had. Do you know? Can you give us some information about that? Or how has changed in their life, in the families, or no, or something that have changed in participating in the project. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you. I wonder if I noticed your hand as well, so perhaps we can get your question or comment as well, and then respond to both.
Sure. So particularly, the question was raised as a result of content that was on Leah's last slide, and she had mentioned that there was imperial guidance regarding the gender equality measurement component. So my question is, because I think in our post-2015 development context in the renewal of the Sustainable Development Goals, there's very akin similarities that FemNorthNet, sorry, it's a mouthful. And what I'm wondering is if each of the participants could comment a little bit on speaking to some of the challenges and the successes around the performance measurement and evaluation components related to both gender and diversity.
Okay. And I think Jess is writing that question so the others can hear it, or can know what it is. Maybe I'll just first start with your question of self-care strategies. I'm not actually the best person to ask. I'm not very good at it. Maybe it's sort of, but I was so struck by how it kept coming up. And actually it was a bit of a lesson to me, I think, as well. Like we all need to pay more attention to this personally as well as organizationally. So I guess one of the communities, one of the things they would do is they would regularly take a group of women out of the community. It was a small, high needs community, right? So they would regularly leave to go to, say, a spa or things like that, right? To spend a day in a relaxing environment where they weren't going to have people from their community coming and asking them to do things or bringing problems to be solved, right? So regularly scheduling some of that. And frankly, I think it's like, was a bit of a challenge for me to sort of see that as legitimate spending, right? So it's beginning to sort of acknowledge these are important things and we need to spend money and spend time on them.
Jane, I wanted to comment, if I could, on the self-care piece.
Yes.
So I think that in FemNorthNet we've recognized that our model of co-leadership, so the fact that you and I share leadership, is actually a self-care strategy. So by doing it together, and each of our themes and our co-led, by doing it together, it takes some coordination. You have to get along and those sorts of things. But it means that when crises or life intervenes in one of our lives, the other can pick it up. So my partner, had surgery a year ago, and I couldn't go for the first part of a trip, the knowledge sharing piece to Labrador between women in Nova Scotia and Labrador. And my colleagues and friends picked it up, and I didn't have to worry. Like, I could pay attention to being at home and taking care of a sick partner because I knew that we'd been rolling together on the development of that piece of it. So I think that's a practice we've been doing.
Thanks, Deborah. And Leah, anything you'd like to add about self-care?
No. I've got a couple of other questions. I can tell you how to not do it.
Yeah, listening to your body when it's telling you to pay attention. So maybe your second question was more written about the history of CRIAW. I actually want us to get something up on our website. So I was looking for it recently and I couldn't find it. But on the CRIAW website, you'll find a lot of material that does sort of speak to its history. And Jess and others are actually revamping the website. So maybe we can make sure there are a couple historical articles put up there too. Yeah. Anything else anyone wants to add on that? Otherwise, I think the question was particularly, the third question was to Leah of the benefits of community participants in being involved in the CVI. And Leah, perhaps you can also speak to the the final question about challenges and successes around participatory measures.
Sure.
Is that okay?
Okay, so first of all, in terms of the benefits to all of the women, so both the community and the academic participants who were involved, we haven't done a lot of detailed analysis on this piece of the data yet. So I'm sort of speaking from my experience in the project, but I can certainly tell you that the evaluations that we received as part of the involvement of the project really focused on how important it was to be asked to go right to the beginning and not just be asked how women's well-being was, but in fact, what was women's well-being. And this actually was one of the most complicated pieces of conducting the research, because it took us a really long time to move away from initially talking about experiences with well-being and sort of backtrack and think about what were we actually talking about when we talked about these experiences of well-being, as in what falls into the basket that constitutes well-being, because that was an entirely foreign experience for people in the community to be asked to take responsibility for the initial definition. And so, but ultimately then that became one of the pieces that community members reflected on a lot. So that was that's sort of one key benefit that I think was quite important. And so then in terms, I'm conscious of the time, so I'll move on to the other question, but I'm happy to talk more later. In terms of challenges and successes and speaking to gender equality measurement, I think that one of the points that is important to make here is that the argument that we're trying to feed into this debate is that this move towards technocratic forms of understanding gender equality is problematic in its categorization of women, but creating these initial definitions that are more inclusive of the diverse understandings of communities is actually one of the ways that we can push against some of the risks of technocracy. So it's not, we are not, I don't sit totally comfortably in the idea that we are sort of trying to generate this quantitative data to talk about community well-being for a lot of the reasons that you might, that sort of you would be reflecting on, I expect, when thinking about the challenges of that. Having said that, because one of our commitments is around trying to think about ways different voices become a part of the conversation and imagining or resigning to the political trend that has to do with looking at privileged forms of data, then this is one of the ways that we can sort of counteract some of the risks that are associated with this approach to more technical measurement strategies.
Thanks, Leah. Now, I believe there's students outside needing to get into this room right away. So I'm going to thank you for joining us and thank everyone for being here.